All right, well, I think it's about time for us to get started. Let me welcome everybody again. We're getting kind of thin. I told a couple of people there's probably more people at home listening than listening here because we have a lot of people with COVID, and we want to remember those folks in our prayer. If you are listening in at home, we are studying the life of David, and we're in 2 Samuel chapters 2 through 5 tonight. But before we begin, I've asked Kenny Webster if he'd lead us in a word of prayer.
Will you bow with me as we pray? Our God and Father in heaven, we come before you with humble hearts, with thanksgiving in our hearts for all that you've done for us and all that you do continue to do for us. We thank you for all your spiritual blessings that you've given us through your Son Jesus and the change it's made in our lives. We're thankful for the time we can be here tonight. Pray that what David has to teach us tonight will be good for us, and we'll learn from it and grow spiritually. And we'll always seek after your will and to become more like your Son Jesus. And teach us always to love others as you've loved us. We pray for all those of our family and here at this congregation who are sick and hurting, especially those who are dealing with COVID at this time. Pray that you give them all healing and help and bless their families. We also lift up Kara Hargett before you tonight and pray that her heart surgery goes well this Friday and you give her quick healing and recovery. Again, we thank you so much for the family you've given us in your Son Jesus and the time we can spend together. Help us always to be a light for others in this world as we go out, and pray that their hearts will see you in us and turn to you and become your children. Again, we give praise to you, and we look forward to being with you in heaven and with each other in heaven. And we pray in everything that your will be done. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, I've got a couple of things before we start this evening. For the last two Sundays, I have noticed depending on either preacher, a verse quoted that comes from the time of the life of David. This past Sunday, Brandon quoted Psalm 27:35, where it says, "I was young and now I'm old, yet I've never seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging bread." And so when we read that, I took out my Bible and I looked up the top and says, yeah, David wrote it. Okay, so we're looking at David's life in general. We've been through about 15 years of his life, but this particular psalm where he gives his, I guess what we would call testimony that God's always been with him throughout his life, we can see in the things that we've studied so far. Secondly, I'm going to do something that John did in his class, and we're going to put the lessons that we expect to learn up front tonight, because a lot of these lessons are just going through a lot of facts in David's life and the lives of people around him, but we're trying to learn lessons as we go through that. So the lessons that we want to pay attention to tonight, one is patience. David was anointed by Samuel to be king when he's 15 years old. The time frame tonight is between the time when he's 30 and 37, and it's taken that long for him to become king of just Judah. So David had to show a lot of patience in waiting for God's promises for him to be fulfilled, and we need to learn that lesson ourselves. Another one is seeking the Lord's will, and we've talked about that several times, and we're going to find 3 times tonight when David ask the Lord's will about what to do. Another one is diplomacy. And when I say that, I'm saying, talking about how we go about things, not what we do. We don't want to go, a lot of times we know what to do, we know what's right, but do we do it in a way that so we get along with everybody, okay? Do we do it diplomatically, okay? And we're going to find instances where David did that. And finally, reining in our own self-interest. When we let the things that we think just has to happen control us, we're in for a lot of trouble, and we can cause a lot of trouble in not just our lives, but those around us. And we're going to find somebody in these chapters tonight that was that way. All right, so let's begin and go on to David's life. Now, where David is, when we finished last week's lesson, Saul had just been killed in the battle up in the Jezreel Valley, north of what's shown on this map. And David is still living in Ziklag. He's down here in the bottom. He's been there for a year and 4 months, living among the Philistines. And when he'd gone up, remember, he'd gone off to war with the Philistines. When he came back, the city had been burned and all of his men's families had been carried off. So they go and rescue them. Now David's back in Ziklag, and that's the situation where we are today. So let's begin by reading the first 2 verses of 2 Samuel chapter 2. And by the way, if you see a mistake on the slides, there's bound to be one. There was one last week. Feel free to wave at me and tell me. All right. In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" he asked. The Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" And to Hebron the Lord answered. So David went up there with his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. So David appears to have learned his lesson about asking God what to do, and he says, "All right, I've been over here in the land of the Philistines, but is it time to go home?" And he asks, and God answers yes. And all of the yes or no questions that David's asking, he's probably getting the answer through the priest and the Urim and the Thummim. That's 2 little pieces that's part of the priest's uniform. So God says, yes, go up. And so David goes to Hebron. And that's where he begins, his reign as king. Let's keep reading and read verses 3 through 7. David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. And when David was told that it was the men from Jabesh Gilead who had buried Saul, he sent messengers to them to say to them, "The Lord bless you for showing this kindness to Saul, your master, by burying him. May the Lord now show you kindness and faithfulness, and I too will show you the same favor because you have done this. Now then, be strong and brave, for Saul, your master, is dead, and the people of Judah have anointed me king over them." All right, I'm going to do something dangerous here. I'm going to skip ahead. We're still on this slide. I just want to get ahead to a different map. Okay, this is the map that shows that we had last week that shows all of Israel. So David goes to Hebron and settles in Hebron and the towns around it, him and his 600 men and all their families. And he's anointed as king. So this is the second time that he's anointed, right? Samuel did it the first time, probably when he was about 15 years old. And now, finally, David is anointed king, but only of Judah. All right, but then what does he do? He remembers or he hears what the men of Jabesh Gilead had done for Saul. And I'm just see if I can point at that up here. There's Jabesh Gilead just on the east side of the Jordan River. And the battle where Saul was killed was on the west side of the Jordan River, just across from there. And at the end of the battle, the Philistines had cut off Saul's head, and they hung his body on the walls of this town of Bethshan. And as we read last week, the warriors from Jabesh Gilead marched all night to Bethshan, went over there, took down the body, took it back home, burned it, and buried the bones. So they gave Saul a decent burial, which the Philistines had just left his body to hang on the city wall. So when David hears about it, he sends a letter to them as king of Judah, kind of sending, like we would send a thank you letter for somebody doing, who had done something that was really good. What's another word that we might use for what David has done? Let me scoot back here to the right slide. Here we go. What's the next, what would we call this? David sending word as the king to these people, a letter of congratulations. What's that part of? It's one of the words we used in the lessons that we're trying to get from today, right? This idea of diplomacy, right? And he's not king over these people. He's king over Judah, which is just the area south of Jerusalem here in the land of Palestine. But he hears of what they've done that's good. He's now king of Judah, and so he thanks them for doing that. That's pretty smart, actually, from the standpoint of just being nice to people. Now, we know that David has been told that he's going to be king over all Israel, and he wants to be their king too, but he doesn't just march up through the middle of the country and say, I'm your king for everybody, okay? But he does start out by sending this letter to the people of Jabesh Gilead, thanking them for burying Saul. But David's trying to be nice, but there is a divide going on. David is king of Judah, and you've still got Saul's household left. There's one of Saul's sons that's still alive. Let's move on down and read verses 8 through 11 of chapter 2, and we'll find out what's going on with that. Meanwhile, Abner, son of Ner, the commander of Saul's army, had taken Ishbosheth, son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. He made him king over Gilead, Asherie, and Jezreel, and also over Ephraim, Benjamin, and all Israel. Ishbosheth, son of Saul, was 40 years old when he became king over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. The tribe of Judah, however, remained loyal to David. The length of time David was king in Hebron over Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Okay? So the country's now divided. Abner, who was Saul's commanding general, makes Ishbosheth king, and he sets him up at this place called Mahanaim, which is over on the, push the wrong button, the east side of the Jordan River. And he probably does that because the Philistines, remember, are pretty much in control. They won this big battle up in the Jezreel Valley, and so they were in large part in control. But he can make Ishbosheth king, set him up over at Mahanaim, and he's going to be pretty safe. So that's what happens. And the scripture here tells us that he's king for 2 years. Is not a very long time. And meanwhile, David is king in Hebron over only the tribe of Judah. So there's this built-in conflict. Even though David wants to be king of everybody, it certainly doesn't happen initially. And since there is this conflict, there's eventually a war, or at least battle. Abner takes some of his people from Mahanaim and brings some of his troops and takes them across the river down here to Gibeon. Now, Gibeon is Saul's hometown. And Joab, leader of David's people, he takes some of David's people up from Hebron and goes up to Gibeon. And so the two armies are sitting there across from each other in a pool. And a really strange thing to me happens. They have some sort of one-on-one conflict between people from the two armies. They get 12 people from the armies of Israel and 12 people from the armies of Judah and have them fight. And I don't know if it's like Goliath. He said, just send me one. We'll have a one-person combat, and whoever wins, that wins. But this doesn't work. All 12 of these guys, they kill each other. Each pair kills the other. But once that happens, then a general battle breaks out. And when that happens, the troops from Judah are winning. They're defeating the people from Israel, and so they start chasing. And now we come across people whose names we want to remember, because they're going to teach us some of the lessons that we have tonight. Let's skip down to 2 Samuel 2, and we're going to read verses 18 through 19. Slide. Okay, the three sons of Zeruiah were there. Now, Zeruiah is David's sister. Okay, so these people are his nephews. Right? Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now, Asahel was fleet-footed as a wild gazelle. He chased Abner, turning neither to the right nor to the left as he pursued him. Abner looked behind him and asked, "Is that you, Asahel?" And it is, he answered. All right, so as Abner and his troops are fleeing, there appears to be, individual battles among the various soldiers that are either chasing or running. One of them chasing is Asahel, and he's fast enough that he catches Abner. But he really shouldn't have done that. Abner recognizes who he is because David has been in Saul's army, right? And these are David's nephews, although they may have been the same age. And Abner doesn't want to fight with Asahel, but Asahel won't give up, and eventually Abner has to kill him. And this causes much grief later. So as the other troops come by Asahel's body, they pause for a minute, then go on chasing Abner. He retreats further, and finally Abner and his troops wind up on a hilltop, apparently surrounded by the people of Judah. But Abner says something really smart in this situation. Let's read verse 26. Abner called out to Joab, "Lest the sword devour forever. Don't you realize that this will end in bitterness? How long before you order your men to stop pursuing their fellow Israelites?" So Abner says, we're getting a civil war going. This is not going to end well. And so Joab, at least at the time, calls off his people. Abner takes his folks, goes back to Mahanaim, and Joab and the people of Judah go back to Hebron. So the war cools down for a little bit, but not for long, because Ishbosheth is still king and David is still king. All right, so let's go to the first verse of chapter 3. The war between the house of Saul and the house of David lasted a long time. David grew stronger and stronger while the house of Saul grew weaker and weaker. Also, we want to notice verse 6. During the war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner had been strengthening his own position in the house of Saul. All right, so this war is going on quite a while, apparently the 2 years that Ishbosheth was king. One other thing we want to notice here, the verses in between 1 and 6 that we didn't read, it lists 6 sons that David had while he lived in Hebron. There's a little problem with that too. How many mothers do we have? We have 6. They're all sons of different wives. Okay, so David is accumulating wives as all this goes along, and the fact that he has children from several different women also winds up trouble later in life as these children don't necessarily get along with each other. Okay, that's just something to remember for later. Okay, but in the meantime, the war's going on. It says Abner is strengthening his own position in the house of Saul. And finally, after a while, Ishbosheth does something really stupid. He accuses Abner, and Abner's the only reason he's king. He accuses Abner of sleeping with one of Saul's concubines. The text doesn't tell us if that's true or not, but he accuses him. And if that's what he was doing, that's the kind of thing where some person might do if he was going to take over from the previous king. He would take over his wife. Okay, and so Ishbosheth accuses Abner of doing that, and that doesn't go over well with Abner. Abner threatens to take everybody, all of Israel, and take them over to David. So let's skip down and read verses 9 and 10. And this is Abner talking. May God deal with Abner, be it ever so severely, if I do not do for David what the Lord promised him on oath, and transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and establish David's throne over Israel and Judah, from Dan to Beersheba. So after that, Ishbosheth, he didn't say anything else to Abner. But it's already too late. And Abner begins negotiations with David to do what he's threatened to do, to turn the kingdom over to him. Verse 12, Abner sent messengers to David. Says, make an agreement with me and I will help you bring all Israel over to you. And now let's read verses 13 and 14. David agrees, but he has one condition. Good, said David, I will make an agreement with you, but I demand one thing of you. Do not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, daughter of Saul, when you come to see me. Now we remember that Michal was Saul's daughter that he gave to David in marriage, okay? And then later took away. Then David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, son of Saul, demanding, give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself for the price of a Philistine horse. So David says, okay, that's a good plan. But first you got to give me my wife. So Ishbosheth sends her back. To me, that would make me think that Ishbosheth is realizing that the kingdom is going to go back to David too. But what has Saul made David promise about his children? What did David promise? He swore an oath to Saul that he wouldn't do. He wouldn't kill all of his sons, right? Because that's another thing that happened in those days. If you wanted to wipe out a kingdom, not only did you kill the king, you killed all his sons. So there wasn't anybody left to be king. But David had promised not to do that. So Ishbosheth sends David's first wife, Michal, back to him. And then Abner confers with the elders of Israel, get them to go actually, take themselves out from under Ishbosheth and go to David. Let's read verse 21. And after he does that, he goes to David. Now, we're here where the agreement appears to be done. Then Abner said to David, "Let me go at once and assemble all Israel for my lord the king, so that they may make a covenant with you and that you may rule over all your heart desires." So David sent Abner away and he went in peace. So we got negotiations going on, right? We have diplomacy. It looks like the kingdom is going to transition peacefully. And it probably would have, except for Joab. He's not happy. All right, so let's keep going. Now, while Abner is negotiating with David, Joab is not there. He's apparently out with the raiding party. When he gets back and finds out that David has made this agreement with Abner, he's not happy because Abner has killed his brother. Right? Even though it's in battle, there wasn't anything, it wasn't murder. And Abner didn't, he had to do it to protect his own life. There was nothing illegal or immoral about Abner's killing of Asahel. But Joab wasn't going to be deterred at all. So when he finds out that David has made this agreement with Abner and sent him away in peace, like under a flag of truce, we might say, Abner sends and calls him back. All right, so let's read verses 27, probably 30, and see what Joab does. Now, when Abner returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside into an inner chamber. Now, this picture is supposed to depict Joab killing Abner. It's obviously not in an inner chamber, so whoever drew this must not have read the text. Anyway, Joab took him aside into an inner chamber as if to speak with him privately, and there, to avenge the blood of his brother Asahel, Joab stabbed him in the stomach, and he died. Later, when David heard about this, he said, "I and my kingdom are forever innocent before the Lord concerning the blood of Abner, son of Ner. May his blood fall on the head of Joab and on his whole family. May Joab's family never be without someone who has a running sore or leprosy, or who leans on a crutch, or who falls by the sword, who lacks food." Joab and his brother Abishai murdered Abner because he had killed their brother Asahel in the battle of Gibeon. All right, so Abner is now dead. He's the one who actually put Ishbosheth in power. But he's been murdered by Joab, leader of David's troops. Now, from everything here and from what David himself said, he didn't know anything about what Joab was doing. He was not involved at all in Abner's murder. As a matter of fact, he mourns Abner's death. Now, my old man, there's a word that I can't remember. Oh, David writes the lament for Abner. The lament is the word that I couldn't. And David takes part in Abner's funeral, and Abner's buried in great honor there in Hebron. And David treats him as he's a man of honor. But David doesn't do anything to Joab. Now, I don't know if y'all have read ahead and read this or not. Why do you think David doesn't do anything to Joab? And there's not an answer here in the text. So, Brandon, I'll put you on the spot. You got any idea why he didn't do anything to Joab? Okay. Okay, well, David does eventually kill Joab, but it's like 40 years later. Okay, when Solomon becomes king, David tells Solomon, make sure that Joab doesn't go down to the grave in peace, and Solomon has Joab killed. But that's nearly 40 years later, because David's king for 40 years. Why doesn't he do anything now? Just one of the puzzling things here, and I don't have a good answer. Could be because he's his nephew. Could be because, or could it be because David is a little afraid of Joab? Let's read the last verse in this chapter. Verse 39. Here David is talking. He says, "And today, though I am the anointed king, I am weak, and these sons of Zeruiah are too strong. May the Lord repay the evildoer according to his evil deeds." Okay, so David's kind of asking God to do the punishment here. But it almost sounds like he's a little afraid of Joab. Maybe because Joab was the one who's leading the troops. I don't know. But for whatever reason, David doesn't have Joab punished, or at least not for a long time. And now we have Abner out of the way. Now Abner, what's he been doing? He's been trying to negotiate the transfer of Israel under David. But he's now dead. What about Ishbosheth? Well, if we turn over to chapter 4, we'll find that Ishbosheth is murdered by a couple of Saul's former leaders, a fellow named Baanah and one named Rechab. It says in verse 2 of chapter 4 that these men had been leaders of Saul's raiding band. Okay, and I don't know if they saw the handwriting on the wall or whatever, but they go into Ishbosheth's home in the middle of the day while he's taking a middle of the day rest, and they kill him. They must think David is going to be happy because they cut off his head. They travel all night to David in Hebron and say, "Hey, Ishbosheth is dead." But David reminds them what happened to the guy who brought him news of Saul's death. What happened to that person? Remember, after the battle, somebody came from Saul's camp and told David that Saul had asked him to kill him, that he did. So what did David do to them? Had him executed, right? Well, he does the same thing to these guys, and with good reason, because they had actually murdered Ishbosheth. Let me read verse 11 and 12 of chapter 4. "How much more when wicked men have killed an innocent man in his own house and on his own bed, should I not now demand his blood from your hand and rid the earth of you?" So David gave an order to his men. They killed them. They cut off their hands and feet, hung the bodies by the pool in Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in Abner's tomb in Hebron, which seems an appropriate thing to do. I mean, in terms of where you bury Ishbosheth. So now we've got just David as the only person who would reasonably be king. Okay, but even that doesn't happen immediately because well, in my opinion, probably because Abner isn't there to complete the negotiation, right? Let's. I don't want to keep getting lost in my notes, wanting to skip ahead. It takes a while for the elders of the other tribes to get their act together and say, yeah, we all need to be king under David. Okay, Abner had been doing that, but he's not around anymore, and so it takes some time for that to happen. And remember, we've already read that Ishbosheth was only king for 2 years, right? No. Remind me if I've said this before, that David is king in Hebron for 7.5 years. We read that yet? Okay. So it takes some time then for all this to happen, and it probably could have happened pretty quickly had Joab not killed Abner. All right, but Joab was too concerned with his own revenge. Right, that's the last one of our lessons. What happens when we're too concerned with what our rights are, getting what we think we deserve? Are we effective in serving God when we do that? No, not really. And it also ought to give us pause to think about, maybe every now and then we're going to have to give up something that we had every right to, just because it'll work out better for God's purposes if we don't do that. And what Joab did was not right. What he did was murder. Plain and simple, okay? And as far as I can see from reading these passages, caused a delay, and David was actually able to become king. All right, if we skipped over to 1 Chronicles chapter 12, which also, we're not going to do that, which also talks about David becoming king, we find that a bunch of the troops from the other tribes see David with the express purpose of making him king. If you want to read verse 23 and verse 38, you'll find that in Hebron. These were thousands and thousands of people. Right, and then let's get back to where we are in 1 Samuel, and let's read the first 3 verses of chapter 5, which tells us what happened when David became king. All the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "We are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. The Lord said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you will be their leader, their ruler.' When all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel." So now finally David is king over all of Israel. All right? Let's read the next couple of verses. David was 30 years old when he became king. He reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. In Jerusalem, reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. Just look how long it's taken for God's promises to be fulfilled. Yet David has had the patience to let God work out those things in his own time. Right? That's a lesson that all of us need to learn. When I think back to my life, my working life, it took a long time for me to get to where I thought I was doing just what I was best suited for, and in a position of authority is not the right word, but I did something that mattered. Okay. It took a long time to get to there. All right, and you young people that are working or just going to work, your careers, some of those things take a long time too. Brenda, did you always want to be a pulpit minister? You didn't, okay. But it took a long time to get there, right? Anyway. Okay, and you had to grow up. All right, and that's what David had to do here too. He needed this time to get ready to be king. All right? All right, let's keep going. We still have a lot to cover. In these verses, it tells us why they chose him to be king. When they came there, he said, "You're one of us. You're an Israelite like us." And they mentioned that David had led Saul's armies, so his military prowess, and also, of course, God's approval. All right, now we're really going to have to hurry to get through the rest. So, we read verses 4 and 5 about how long David reigned. So, sometime, we don't know how, yeah, we do. We know he reigned 7 years in Hebron. So, after a while, David decides to go up and make Jerusalem his capital. This is a good thing from a diplomatic point of view, too, because at the time, Jerusalem was still ruled by the Jebusites. It wasn't part of Judah. It wasn't part of any of the other tribes, all right? So it'd be a good place to go set up a capital that wouldn't bother anybody. And also, as a little fact here, Joab leads the attack, and so because of that, he's given command of David's army. David lives in the fortress that they've just commandeered, and it's called the City of David, and then the whole city is built up around that. One other thing we want to notice real quickly is in chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, David builds his palace. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent envoys to David along with cedar logs, carpenters, and stonemasons, and they built a palace for David. Then David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. So now, not only is David, using diplomacy within the country, but he's using it without, because Hiram sends people to build David's palace and all the materials to do that. Now, if I am correct, I believe Tyre is a very upper city on the coast of the Mediterranean on this map, up at the last red dot. I think if we saw the rest of the map, it would say Tyre outside. Okay, so that's, but the king of Tyre sends David the materials to build his palace. Then, in the last part of chapter 5, which we don't have to go over, David finally has to fight the Philistines. Remember, he's been a vassal of the Philistines, lived in their country, but now he's king over all of Israel. And so the Philistines come to attack, and they attack the valley of Rephaim, which is just southeast of Jerusalem. Or, see this place called Baal Perazim? That's the name given to the battle place after the first battle. The thing we want to notice here is that David inquires of the Lord whether he should go and fight them. And he gets the answer, yes. So he does that. And then sometime later, they have another battle in the same valley, but there's a different strategy. God tells him a different way to attack. The second time, they're to attack from behind through a row of trees. Okay, when they hear the wind blowing through the trees. So again, David follows what God tells him to do. Right? One of our lessons. Now, quickly, let's go over these lessons. First, the idea of patience. God anoints, or Samuel anoints David when he's about 15. He doesn't become king at all until he's 30. And then 7 years later, he's king over all Israel. So it takes from the time he's 15 or 16 years old till he's 37 for this promise to be fully fulfilled. Right? So good lesson for us. Good things sometimes take time. And we need to let God work out the things that he's going to do in his time. The idea of diplomacy. Look at all these places where David was used diplomacy, that were how he did things was important. First, the people of Jabesh Gilead. Then his negotiations with Abner and Ishbosheth. And then finally, he makes a covenant with the elders of the tribes of Israel in order to become king. And then the king of Tyre. And then the last two lessons, David kept seeking God's will. And then we have this awful example of Joab seeking his own self-interest. Okay, next time, read the next chapter in 2 Samuel, chapter 6. We've spent this time going over a bunch of chapters at once. Now we're going to have one lesson, one chapter. All right, thanks for your attention.